discover the Rosary this month. May we all keep these moments of Christ's life in our hearts, pondering them as Our Lady did. I'll see you next week. A special item on EWTNRC.com this month is the Pray from Your Heart Olive Wood Rosary and Heart. Exclusive to EWTN and in honor of Our Lady of the Rosary, this set includes a matching rosary and pocket heart made from local olive wood in the Holy Land. The pocket heart is engraved with the message, Pray from Your Heart. To order, go to EWTNRC.com and search for item number 75HT.
Welcome to EWTN News presents the Synod on Synodality in Rome. I'm Catherine Hadro. It's the final week of the Synod, and delegates are once again devoted to small group discussions and speeches today in the full assembly to discuss the final Synod document, as well as to make requests for changes. Those tasked with incorporating the requested amendments will work on it Thursday and Friday, while the rest of the Synod members will have a break. The final draft will be presented to delegates on Saturday. And in other news out of the Vatican, one of the bishops that Pope Francis announced would be elevated to cardinal this December has asked to not be created a cardinal. Pope Francis has honored that request. And now here joining me throughout this week are my two co-hosts. Dr. Matthew Bunson is Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News, and Father Thomas Petri is President of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. Well, Matthew, just addressing that bit of news there, it was surprising to hear we're going to have 20 new cardinals in December, not 21.
You're absolutely right. His name is Bishop Paschalis Siokor. He is from Indonesia. He's 68 years old, so he would have been a member for an eligible voter for a potential conclave for quite some time, obviously. Then he chose not to accept Pope Francis's appointment of him to the College of Cardinals. The official Vatican communique stated that he wished to remain closer to his people and to continue developing in the spiritual life. And Pope Francis has chosen to honor that request. Now, as a matter of historical interest, cardinals, bishops who are appointed or priests who are appointed do not necessarily have to accept appointment to the College of Cardinals. It's similar in a way to being appointed a bishop, but a very different thing sacramentally. You don't have to accept. In this case, he chose not to. Most recently, we tend to think that this hasn't happened or doesn't happen. Well, it has, actually, just 2 years ago, when Bishop Luc van Looy of Belgium was appointed by Pope Francis and declined appointment. Now, he was notably in his 80s at that point, so he wouldn't have been an elector. So this changes just slightly the body of potential voters in any prospective conclave.
You know, I think a cynic might wonder if the stated reason is in fact the real reason, right? But it is important also then to note, however, that cardinals, once you're created a cardinal, there really is more responsibility and obligations to come to the Holy See, several times a year. And so I do think it's important to say that, and that it would take a bishop away from his diocese more often than any other bishop.
Yeah, that's right. We take him at his word that he wants to remain close to his people. He wants to continue to develop in the spiritual life, as he's been saying. But to Father's point, too, you have to fly to Rome on a fairly regular basis, not just for consistories. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio always famously quipped that he would do everything he could to avoid coming to Rome. He didn't actually like coming here for meetings and things. So we have that. Now, for those who are also wondering, Indonesia still does have a cardinal elector. That's Cardinal Suharyo, who was recently appointed also by Pope Francis. The numbers remain what they are. Pope Francis has still appointed about 80% of the cardinal electors who might gather in any potential upcoming conclave.
Can you contextualize that even more? Is that a significant amount, and where around the globe have they largely been appointed?
Well, one way of looking at it is that there were about 48 countries represented in the 2013 conclave among the cardinal electors. This time, were they to gather, say, coming up. We pray for Pope Francis. Does not seem likely, but a conclave today, for example, would have representatives from about 70 countries. So Pope Francis has vastly expanded the geographical reach of the College of Cardinals. He has also appointed cardinals, as we all know, from the periferia, as he puts it, from many, many dioceses across the world who had not been previously represented in the college, who also are bishops representing or shepherds of tiny Catholic populations.
That is absolutely really interesting. And again, we'll be joined by one of those cardinals on this very program in just a bit. There's a lot more to discuss throughout this week. We're getting closer and closer to that final document. But for now, we'll continue our coverage right after this short break.
You've enjoyed his insights on EWTN's popular television program, Father Spitzer's Universe. Now, journey to the intersection of faith and reason with his exciting new book based on his show. In Father Spitzer's Universe, Exploring Life's Big Questions, Father Spitzer shares his evidence-based answers to life's great mysteries, from near-death experiences and proofs of God's existence to the real presence in the Eucharist and the pivotal topics of faith, science, philosophy, and culture, bravely sharing his own experiences of learning to trust God through life's trials and tribulations. Discover page after page of answers that will challenge you to see God's caring hand at work in the universe and especially your life. Father Spitzer's Universe, Exploring Life's Big Questions by Father Robert Spitzer, the latest release from EWTN Publishing. Now available at EWTNRC.com or call 1-800-854-6316.
I think every single person is called by God with a purpose. And so the question then becomes, how do we live out our purpose? The mission of the Lila Rose Show is to bring people together where we can discover how can we live the most beautiful and fulfilling lives, how to have the healthiest relationships, how to discover wellness, and then go on a deeper journey in our faith to draw closer to God so that we're able to, together, live lives that are flourishing.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck, inviting you to join me next time when our guest author is Father Ken Geraci, CPM. His book, Spiritual Warfare and Divine Mercy, the Weapon for Our Times.
And they're asking for a way to pray, a way to engage in the fight to help win souls for Christ. And the most two powerful weapons next to the Mass would be the Rosary and the Chaplet of Divine Mercy.
That's Father Ken, next time, right here on Bookmark.
I'm Tracy Sable tonight on EWTN News Nightly. As Election Day draws closer, the Vice President makes remarks about abortion that spark concern from the faithful. Plus, the Holy Father reminds the faithful to invite the Holy Spirit to protect their marriage and families. Join us for news from a Catholic perspective.
Welcome back to our ongoing coverage of the Synod on Synodality. We are joined now by Archbishop Timothy Broglio, president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and one of the U.S. delegates to the Synod on Synodality. Your Excellency, thanks for taking the time to join us during your break here.
Very happy to be with you, and it's always good to be with folks from EWTN.
Well, we appreciate it. We spoke with you last year, actually, in October. You were here all last month. You've been here all this month. Just starting us off, can you compare the two Octobers and how this year's General Assembly has compared?
I guess I would say two things. One, I think we're much more serene this time around because I think people are used to the method and they're more comfortable with one another. I mean, you see some people that at least I've seen some people that I met last year that I didn't know before, and so that's been a little bit easier. But I also think I've noticed that the days are very long. Yeah. So I think people are, I think they're anxious to be done with it.
Yeah, I can imagine so.
You know, one of the things that we've been talking about for the last several years about the synods is this concept of synodality. And it seems to me that finally we're starting to understand what that is. Can you explain a little bit more what do we mean even by the word?
Well, I think it's the notion that we walk together. And of course, for us, we walk together with Christ. So that's probably the primary thing. But I think also the notion that even in terms of governance, that we try to arrive at a consensus and in that way go forward. And so I think in that sense it's a very, very positive concept.
How do you think? Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
How do you think the U.S. Church could improve in synodality at the parish level, at the diocesan level?
Well, I think certainly at the parish level, I think the notion of everyone's co-responsibility. I remember years ago when I was a young diocesan priest, Bishop Hickey, who was then the Bishop of Cleveland, wrote a letter on co-responsibility. And I don't think that ever really reached, I think he had some very clear ideas, but I don't think it ever really reached the communities that we're really all charged. We all make up the church. We're all the living stones. And I think if we're able to put that together on the parish level, then it'll make more sense on the diocesan level as well.
One of the things we know that's been talked about, and this came up in some of the theological or pastoral theological forums, is this question that was even raised, I think, at last year's synod of elevating the authority of Episcopal conferences and doctrinal authority. Now, you're the current president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Can you share some of your thoughts on that?
Well, that is one of the crucial areas of the whole discussion. And I think very simply, the office of bishop is by divine right. I mean, it's part of the constitution of the church. Episcopal conferences are something that really we invented in the last century, and that's certainly very good to work together and so forth. But I think those distinctions have to be maintained, and also the bishop's responsibility in his diocese before God for the salvation of the people that have been entrusted to his pastoral care. It's very important not to lose that concept in some sort of notion of shared weight.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like even now, when the USCCB, when you all promulgate a document or a policy, it's only obliging to every bishop if the Holy See confirms it or gives it their stamp of approval. Otherwise, if it doesn't have that, it's just sort of like a gentleman's agreement, correct?
That is correct, except for those things in canon law that we are obliged to determine as a conference, things like what will constitute penance, what is clerical dress in the United States. So those sort of things were required by the Code of Canon Law to determine as a conference, and then that's binding on everyone. It becomes part of the law of the Church in the United States. However, other things that require the confirmatio of the Holy See, those are binding only if we have that confirmatio.
Your Excellency, can you speak about the role of prayer at the Synod, how you've seen prayer incorporated, and how to ensure that the Church guards and ensures that the Holy Spirit is guiding these delegates?
I think that's been one of the crucial elements of the Synod, is that we've tried to do everything with a spirit of prayer, even in terms of when you're using the conversation of the Holy Spirit at the table. There's always a moment for prayer. Even between the interventions, when we have discussions on the floor, there's always time after 5 or 6 people have spoken. There's 2 or 3 minutes to pray, and I think that's been very, very helpful, and it's a good sign that we're we're not in the halls of Congress here, but we're trying to operate very much in tune with the Holy Spirit.
As we've been talking about the Synod this week here on EWTN, we framed it, this concept that really started after the council of this distinction between concilium. Remember the concilium journal, Karl Rahner, all of it, versus communio. Yes. And it does seem that there have been over this pontificate, competing ideas of what these synods are. One is this communio. It is about prayer and walking together and discernment, versus others who seem to see it as a parliament that can actually affect doctrinal or practical change. And the Holy Father's been very clear that that's not what he wants, but somehow it seems to me that message hasn't gotten to every participant or every sort of pundit watching the synods.
Yes, and I think that's very true. There is a tendency on the part of some to think that this is, I have this goal, and so I'm going to push for it. That's certainly not the Holy Father's intention. I remember the first time that I met him as, actually the second time I met him as president of the conference, and we talked about the synod. And he made it very clear that it had to be the work of the Holy Spirit, and the result had to be harmony. And he said, people who are expecting changes from the synod, that's not going to happen. So somehow that may have been lost on the ears of some participants, but that's certainly very clear in the minds of most of us, and certainly very much in the mind of the Holy Father.
One consequence of the gathering of bishops is you're hearing from brother bishops from all around the world in different regions. Has there been, including challenges and also just beautiful things happening in the church, has there been a particular testimony that's struck you, that stood out to you this month?
Yes, really. I'm with a bishop from Nepal at my table, both at the beginning and now at the conclusion of the synod. And just to hear about his reality, they're very much a minority. You have to get an affidavit if you want to convert to Christianity.
Wow.
That in which you say you weren't forced or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So it's a very, very different reality from anything that I've ever experienced. And so it was very interesting to hear him talk about being this very, very small flock in a relatively large country.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be a very broad question, but as the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of the Military Services, I think what's on everyone's mind, of course, is Ukraine and Israel. And of course, we must have priests in these areas ministering to our military. I mean, have you had any direct experience of this and what that's been like?
Well, I shortly after being elected president, I went to Ukraine and visited for 5 days, visited both Lviv and Kyiv. And of course, horrified by the destruction of war, and spent a little bit of time underground because of bombing raids and so forth. And then, most recently, the Catholic bishops of Ukraine asked me to write both to the President of the Republic and to the equivalent of the Speaker of the House to plead that they make an exception, because they wanted to draft priests, both our priests and Orthodox priests, into the military as fighters, not as chaplains, but as combatants. And I tried the best I could to, explain by letter that this was not appropriate. Of course, it's also against the Geneva Convention, but unfortunately, I didn't meet with much success. So, I mean, that's very much of a reality that's very present for those people. And we have invited one of the Ukrainian bishops to come to the General Assembly in November to speak to, first to be with us in those days, so that we can also manifest our concern for the people of Ukraine, but then also so that he can speak to us and tell us a little bit about the reality and what they're experiencing, and perhaps also ways that we might be able to help.
I'm surprised to hear that there's a possibility of priests being drafted, and that's not been really reported. And I mean, that's horrifying just even to think about that.
It really is. I couldn't believe it, and the response that I did receive a response was, well, Ukrainian law does not foresee this an exception.
And of course, last year's October Synod, the backdrop was the Israel-Hamas war and the October 7th attack. Our prayers continue for the faithful in that region as well. In our remaining minute with you, Your Excellency, for our viewers at home who maybe they're not paying attention to what's happening here in Rome, maybe they're confused about what's happening here, what's your message to them, and what will you be taking with you back to the U.S. from the Synod?
The message to them, I think, is basically to live the Catholic faith, and to keep in mind what the Second Vatican Council said in the document on the laity, that the most important way we give witness to our faith is by being the leaven in society that permeates society and really manifests the gospel in a lived way. And hopefully that's also an invitation then to other people to embrace the gospel. So I would think that would be the most important thing to take home. And in terms of the Archdiocese, of course, ours is a very, very unique situation, even in terms of consultation. It's something that we best do online because we don't really have that possibility of convoking people. But we will try to be, look for opportunities to invite people to participate in a synodal way in the activities of the Archdiocese.
Well, Your Excellency, we thank you for your time. We know it's been a busy week. We know a busy next few weeks with the Bishops' Conference coming up in Baltimore as well soon as Archbishop Timothy Broglio. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. And our coverage continues right after this break.
The EWTN home video highlight for October is Wolves in the Fold. Explore the turbulent waters of modern philosophy to see how Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud galvanized popular opinion with radical ideas that challenged church teaching.
Marxism has given the church a blow. It absolutely has. It's caused us to question our heroes, our institutions, our government, and our churches. And if you look at a lot of mainstream Protestant churches, some of them are in free fall.
Leading with a positive vision of what a good life is. And the Catholic Church has everything within her to present a positive vision. Marxist ideology can only break things down. And the Catholic Church, at its very core, is a life-giving institution.
Order your DVD at EWTNRC.com, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or call 1-800-854-6316.
Tonight on EWTN Live, author Paul Kingor helps us view suffering through the eyes of saints who experienced the wounds that Christ endured on the cross on the next EWTN Live.
America stands at a tipping point in the ongoing battle to protect the dignity of all human life. Whether on television, radio, print, or online, EWTN News brings insight and analysis from a Catholic perspective on the important issues that will affect you in 2024 and beyond. EWTN News Election 2024. Discover, discern, engage. Go to EWTNnews.com/election.
Welcome back to our ongoing coverage of the Synod on Synodality here in Rome. It was great to speak with Archbishop Timothy Broglio, of course, president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. Father, anything that stood out to you in particular?
Well, of course, the Archbishop is always wonderful to speak to. You know, he always has great insights and great thoughts. I'm still flabbergasted by this notion, or this idea, this seems to be happening, of priests getting drafted into the military. And you know, he said the response that he received was Ukrainian law doesn't have that kind of exception, but this is the Geneva Convention. I mean, and I know we have a lot of actors on the world stage that don't follow the Geneva Convention, but this is a problem.
Well, and we also have the special status that chaplains are supposed to have. We have archdioceses or dioceses for the military across the globe in different settings and under different laws, of course. But the idea of sort of press ganging or drafting priests is abhorrent to many people, and I think this would even extend across other faiths who might find themselves in a combat situation like that.
It'd be hard to imagine, for instance, are they going to be drafting imams and, you know, rabbis as well? It's very hard. But the other thing that he mentioned, I think that was really great, is just how this process, you know, in response to a question you asked, Catherine, has helped him to see the life of the church in other dioceses and his experience with Nepal and the Bishop of Nepal.
Yeah, I thought his reflection on the Bishop of Nepal was really quite poignant. But it demonstrates, too, and one of the things that he's talked about previously, is the opportunity that a synod like this, in bringing bishops and participants from around the world to hear those perspectives. We were talking before the interview about Francis picking cardinals from around the world.
Right.
This is a perfect demonstration of the universality of the authentic diversity of the church, but how we also have to be very attentive to the perspectives and lived experiences of Catholics in every setting and in every geographical corner.
And Archbishop Broglio hit on something that Bishop Rhodes said yesterday as well. Compared to last October, there's a little bit more of a calmness to this one. All the delegates, they've done this before. They've been here before. And so even though it's very tedious, it's long days, day after day after day for a month, that there's this kind of rhythm it sounds like they've gotten into, and it's really helpful because we're limited in what we know of what's going on in those synod halls, right? It's really only those press conferences that we can hear more.
There's a tradition in the Vatican speak, whenever they use the word serene, the discussions were serene, it's kind of diplomatic code for things went very well, that there were no contentious issues. And as a longtime diplomat, which he was, Archbishop Broglio used the word serene to describe these proceedings here the last few weeks. And one has the sense, as we've talked to delegates, as we've talked to some of these participants, that, yeah, because they know each other, because they know the process better, I think they're more comfortable with each other.
And also, Father, to the question that you asked, the significance of speaking to the head of the U.S. Bishops' Conference as we're talking about this, the division of the church, if you will, with authority.
Yeah, and he noted that I think he used the phrase, the central issue is this question of doctrinal authority being granted to Episcopal conferences. And he said the same thing that Bishop Rhodes said yesterday, right? That the College of Bishops, the bishop as chief teacher, is of divine origin. And Archbishop Broglio was even more emphatic that the Episcopal conferences have only existed since the 20th century. They're man-made inventions, you know, and so I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback. It'll be interesting to see what comes out Saturday in the final document about that question.
And have amendments being introduced to expand that power for Episcopal conferences? What is the future role of the Synod itself, perhaps, in weighing in on doctrinal matters? Those amendments may have been introduced. We don't know. We may find out. Right. But then the question is, will the members, the participants, have the appetite to approve that?
That's what we're going to continue to wait and see in these coming days. Again, they're discussing those proposed amendments. There will be a bit of a break Thursday and Friday for the delegate members, and then that draft document comes out on Saturday.
He did use a key word, too, in your conversation with him, and that was consensus. Now, the Synod organizers have long used that word consensus as sort of meeting together in the Spirit. And we saw last year that there was, I think to the surprise of some, a strong consensus regarding some of these hot-button issues, in particular the ordination of women to the priesthood, women to the diaconate. I think a consensus has been achieved here, at least one has the sense of it, about the very issue that he's talking about, possible decentralization or the expansion in another direction of Episcopal conferences.
It was an interesting conversation in as much as we talked a little bit about the fact of what synodality is. And he admitted, too, that there are some members of the Synod, there are delegates and some pundits who really do seem to think that this is a place to change doctrine, to change practice, but that even in his own meetings with Pope Francis, the Holy Father has said people want to make changes, but that's not what the Synod is about.
Yeah.
And just yesterday, we had the chance to get more insight into this synod from someone who is seen to be close to Pope Francis. Matthew and I sat down with Cardinal Michael Czerny, the prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Created a cardinal by Pope Francis in 2019, we spoke with His Eminence about various topics that have arisen at this synod, from migration to women's access to the diaconate. Here's our interview. Your Eminence, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
It's a pleasure.
You are seen as someone who is close to our Holy Father, Pope Francis. Can you speak to what the Holy Father's vision was for this synod, and how has this synod compared to last year's?
Well, maybe I'll start with the second. This year we are. Last year we were excited to be learning, meeting, expanding. This year we're working hard to come to practical conclusions, not so much about the mission itself, but about how to be a synodal church. In other words, the ways and means whereby we will be in a better position to carry out the mission that Christ entrusted to us.
Yeah, has there been much discussion on immigration at this synod? And within the framework of synodality, how can we as a church listen even more attentively to those caught up in that phenomenon?
Well, migration is obviously one of the big issues of the world, but it's by far not the only one. And it's important to keep remembering that migration is also a fact of human life. It's not a contemporary crisis, but something that we have been doing since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is that in reflecting on migration this year, we see in it a kind of parable of synodality. In other words, the mobility, the going together, and the seeking of you might say, a better place. This is what synodality is supposed to help us to do, that we would be in a better place to carry out Christ's mission. And so the migrants are not only our deep concern in terms of solidarity and support and evangelization, but they're also a sign of the mobility and the courage that the church needs.
Speaking of listening to our brothers and sisters on the peripheries, you've been doing quite a bit of travel as cardinal and prefect. To name a few, South Sudan, the Amazon, Oceania. What are you hearing from our church on the margins?
Well, honestly, you'd have to ask me, I mean, which church? In other words, I don't think I can generalize. But I do think that I could say and want to say that our church on the margins is a hopeful church. The church on the margins faces enormous difficulties that would make our heads spin, but they're not lacking in hope. They're not lacking in resourcefulness, and they're not lacking in missionary creativity. So I would say as much as they win our concern and sympathy, they also win our admiration.
There's been discussion, we know, including in the various theological forums, looking at structures in the life of the church, authority, primacy, but also the relationship of the local church with the universal church. Within that framework of synodality, where do you see something like decentralization and structures?
Well, both decentralization and structures are both contemporary words, governance words. They're not part of our tradition, but it's all in aid, really, of authority, and it reminds us of what they said in the gospel about Jesus, that he had authority, unlike the scribes and Pharisees. And if you want to sum up the synod, we are seeking ways and means to assure that kind of authority, so that the church will be able to carry out its mission and not be handicapped or distracted by sins and mistakes, which in fact consume and eradicate authority.
We heard Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez. He reaffirmed Pope Francis's position against women's access to the diaconate, adding that the time is not yet ripe. But he stressed that there is a need for a greater role for women in the church. What does that look like?
Well, it looks like, I would say it looks like it already is. In other words, the problem is not finding women to carry out the mission. They're doing it already, and in many different ways, in many different parts of the world. But at this moment, I think we are recognizing that their way of doing mission has to be integrated with the more hierarchical and structural church, and that different forms of recognition, authority, formation, recompense, all these things are required so that women can discover the very different missions and ministries which they can carry out.
Yeah, one of the backdrops for this synod is a world in conflict. And what is needed at this moment, and what role is your Dicastery for integral human development playing to help those who are caught up in this strife?
Well, again, on the second point, basically what we can do is to listen to and accompany the bishops in those areas of conflict, and see how they're doing, see what it is that they might need by way of help or encouragement, and share the news, the stories, the good practices with the rest of the church. On the broader question of a world in conflict, I think many of us are recognizing, experiencing that synodality would go a long way to helping make this world more peaceful, more human, more just, and finally more Christian. And so that encourages us. We're not just doing intra-church housekeeping. We are actually preparing effective and important proposals for the world community.
Pope Francis announced the creation of 21 new cardinals. You were elevated a cardinal yourself in 2019, I believe. As a cardinal, what is your advice to these cardinal elects as they prepare to be elevated to this new position?
My advice to them is to recognize that they're being, as you say, elevated or recognized because of their mission and ministry already. And that now, by being, you might say, publicly recognized and named, that this intensifies their mission. And especially the mission that all of us Christians have, which is to pray for and support the Holy Father. But the cardinals have a very special, explicit role to do that, to the point, as our red garment indicates, to giving our lives.
Yeah, the announcement was made that Pope Francis will be releasing a new encyclical this week, and it caught many by surprise. The topic that he's reflecting on is the Sacred Heart. What does it first tell us about Pope Francis, but also what are you looking forward to in an encyclical that is devoted to the Sacred Heart?
Well, one thing it tells you about Pope Francis is that he's a Jesuit, because we have a long-standing history of involvement and support and development of the devotion to the Sacred Heart.
Yep.
And it's a popular way of expressing the fundamental commitments of our faith, and especially the participation in the love, the mercy, the compassion of Christ for ourselves and for everyone. So it's a re-expression of the central message of the gospel in a symbolic way, in a practically, you might say, material or palpable way that helps to make the love of Christ more tangible, more visible, more, in that sense, comprehensible to people who might not read theological treatises.
Finally, Your Eminence, what do you think the legacy of the Synod on Synodality will be?
I very much hope that the legacy will be a more synodal church. In other words, we have tried to learn what could be the process by which the church could walk more effectively through history, exercising her mission. And we find that the way of doing that is basically to implement Vatican II. And the central insight of Vatican II is that we are all enjoying equal dignity as Christians by our baptism, and that it is as the people of God that we walk together, and that people who are ordained or in authority or both are at the service of God's people, and that this kind of service needs to be refreshed and in a certain sense brought up to date, so that we can be moving more effectively, more flexibly, more generously to respond to the enormous challenges of our times and the great hunger and thirst of our people.
Cardinal Michael Czerny, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us during what I know is a busy week here in Rome.
Thank you.
Again, that was our interview with Cardinal Michael Czerny yesterday. We're grateful for His Eminence's time. Matthew, what stood out to you from that conversation?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First, the very last answer, where he's talking about the legacy of the Synod. Now, one could wonder about the legacy of the Synod he hopes is synodality.
Right.
But I think what he's getting at, as he subsequently elucidated, is a church that truly does walk together going forward as a people of God. But he also said something important in there about the Second Vatican Council, where he talks about how so much of synodality the lived experience of it wants to find its roots in the Second Vatican Council. I thought his answer, too, on the question of the diaconate for women, but the pivoting, as he did, to the role of women in the life of the Church, echoed so many of the phrases and the comments from Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the prefect of the Dicastery of the Faith, in his response to the push that has obviously been happening here for 3, almost 4 weeks, for this call for the women in the diaconate. Again, this idea that, no, this is not the time for it, this is off the table. But let's really focus on what's important, and that is the role of women in the Church.
And how women are already living that out. Father, anything in particular?
Yeah, I was very edified by his comments that the Church on the periphery is a church of hope. Because so often those who are living on the periphery there's conflict, there's persecution, there's war. And I think, especially after our experience, Matthew, in Ecuador last month, that we saw that in South America, where there's poverty and a lot of tension, that the witness of the speakers at the Eucharistic Congress was one of delight and joy and hope in spite of the many challenges. You know, in the United States, we have our issues, you know, and we're a very politically polarized country, but in some ways, that's a very modern and developed, you know, a bit bourgeois problem to have.
A privileged problem.
It's a privileged problem.
Right.
And because of that, I think sometimes in America and the United States, we Catholics can be cynical and, you know, negative about things that are going on. But when you meet Catholics, Christians who are in really difficult areas in the world, that's the least of their concerns. And you find that because they struggle so much, that their faith and hope is increased because they've already seen and felt, in many ways, the grace of God working in such difficult situations.
It's interesting, too, to reflect a little bit on the questions we were able to ask him. So he is the prefect for the Dicastery of Integral Human Development.
Yes.
But just in the course of this about 10-minute interview, we talked about what? We talked about the phenomenon of migration and the plight of migrants and refugees. We talked about the problems of the poor around the world. We talked about the crises, conflicts, wars that are happening everywhere.
Yeah.
That's the backdrop, as was noted in our conversation with him, to this synod, and how there is, I think, a genuine impetus and desire on the part of Pope Francis to use synodality at this moment for the Church to be able to respond to each of those. And it's remarkable to reflect, too, on the fact, as you noted in our conversation with him, Cardinal Czerny is on the road a lot.
Yes.
He is traveling to the corners of the world, so he's seeing these things firsthand. That famous story of his pectoral cross made from the remains of a boat that had found its way to Lampedusa, this great haven for refugees, tells you a lot about the problems that he sees every day, but also, as you said, the hope that as a church we have to bring.
And it was insightful, again, just to get a little bit more of the vision of Pope Francis, too, possibly what he's hoping for with this synod. I want to address a bit of news that we woke up to here in Rome, and that is that Gustavo Gutierrez, who is known as the father of liberation theology, died yesterday at the age of 96. Speak to the significance of this theologian.
Well, Gustavo Gutierrez, of course, was a Dominican. So it was the Dominican province of Peru that announced his death and asked for prayers. Liberation theology was a phenomenon that really began with Gustavo Gutierrez. He's the father of liberation theology, as you mentioned.
1971 book, A Theology of Liberation.
That's correct. And at its best, liberation theology focuses on what we might call the preferential option for the poor. At its worst, and there were liberation theologians who came after Gutierrez who were disciplined heavily by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, because it easily can veer into Marxism, seeing Christ as the great liberator of the underclass, right? Now, Gustavo Gutierrez did have some challenges with the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, you know, but because he is a Dominican, he's a faithful son of the Church, he always wanted his his thoughts, not only to be his true thoughts and what he thought, he did want to make sure that he was in line with the magisterium of the church.
Yeah, and in the heyday, so to speak, of liberation theology, in the 1980s in particular, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, issued 2 different instructions on liberation theology coming out of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. One looked at its more negative aspects, the reality that there are those who had injected or were using Marxist ideas and then trying to combine it with the traditional Catholic or Christian understanding of authentic liberation. The second looked at the more positive aspects of it in the sense of what can we mean by authentic liberation. Both of them, though, I thought were very interesting in how they framed the conversation around the true role of theologians. What are the theologians to do as they examine something like liberation theology? But I think it expanded then into the deeper understanding or self-understanding that theologians have to have about themselves and about their role.
That's exactly right. You know, we often use this word magisterium and speak about the magisterium. When the church uses the word magisterium, it simply means the body of teaching and the office of teaching, which primarily in the church is the office of the bishop and the pope, you know, the bishops in communion with the pope. And we can think of the magisterium in 3 ways. The church, we speak of ordinary magisterium. This is the day in, day out preaching and teaching of every bishop. It's the day in, day out teaching of the pope. That is not guaranteed to be infallible, either for local bishops or for the pope. You know, so anything he says at the Angelus, for instance, he might make an error of fact, but he's also a man of faith, so hopefully not an error of doctrine. But then we can think of the ordinary, what we call the ordinary and universal magisterium. And this is where the great body of the church's doctrine and dogmas are found. This is the magisterium of what bishops and popes have taught in communion always and everywhere throughout the history of the church. And that's most of what we believe. That's where it starts. And then the third level is the extraordinary magisterium. The extraordinary magisterium is when the Pope declares something ex cathedra, infallibly so, or when a council has to declare something. And it usually is one of those things that already has been taught, ordinarily and universally, but there's been some misunderstanding or a heresy. So now it has to be extraordinarily confirmed.
And how should we apply this reality of the magisterium when it comes to our coverage of the Synod and what is coming out of the Synod this week?
Well, you know, this whole question, as now both Bishop Rhodes and Bishop Broglio have said, it's part of the ordinary and universal magisterium, and in some ways also the extraordinary magisterium, that bishops are the chief shepherd, you know, and this is of divine origin. And so it's the bishops who, in their preaching universally and together in communion with the Pope, that we can know and understand what the church actually believes and what it actually teaches. That's not something that can be decided or confirmed by a committee, and much less different conferences in different countries, because the whole point of the faith is not that, you know, it's you have to believe this, this, and this. It is that, but it's more than that, and it's richer than that.
Well, this richness, too, I think is an important point to make, and that is that in some ways, those who are in support of these types of doctrinal changes would put us at a crossroads. We can go in one direction or the other. We can go in the direction of the tradition, the teachings of the church, this rich, beautiful tradition of clarity. We saw that especially with Archbishop Broglio. It was very clear. Or we can head down a road that leads us ultimately, inevitably, to the German Synod and what they're proposing, the German Synodal way. And beyond that, as Pope Francis has notably said, to what becomes an effectively Protestant church. As he said about the German Synod, there already is a, as he put it, very fine Lutheran church here in Germany. We don't need another one.
And I think it's key. We can't get distracted by some of these headlines and sensational topics. We have to keep our eye on the ball and what's at play here this week and with this Synod. Tomorrow, Pope Francis is releasing his 4th encyclical, I believe, devoted to the Sacred Heart. We'll have more analysis on that on Friday. But Matthew, just for our viewers, the rest of the week, what should they expect?
Well, we have the announcement of the encyclical tomorrow, so that's going to dominate most of the headlines, and it's classic Francis in dropping it right in the middle of a synod. But then we're going to have that focus come back to the Synod Hall, not too far from where we're sitting right here.
Yeah.
They're going to be looking at the draft document, looking at the amendments. Hopefully on Saturday they will have these final discussions, a vote, and then there will be a press conference Saturday night for the release of the final report, and then everything else is handed into Francis's hands where it belongs anyway.
And then we'll see what he does from there, which recommendations he takes or does not take.
Right.
We'll be there every step of the way. Well, great to be with you both again on this rainy day in Rome. We'll see how it continues the rest of the week. Matthew, Father, thank you.
Thank you.
And that does conclude today's coverage of the Synod on Synodality's Second General Assembly here in Rome. To find EWTN News' live updates on the Synod, be sure to see our reporting at CatholicNewsAgency.com. And of course, make sure to visit EWTN.com as well. We'll see you at the same time tomorrow here from Rome. God bless.
The holy reminder of the week is the Immaculate Conception Garden Flag. Show your love of church and country with this beautiful garden flag. The United States is consecrated to Our Lady of the Immaculate